ले लो।
नहीं नहीं, ये खत्म हो जाएगा तो मैं उधर ही नीचे बैठना है। या या नहीं, या नहीं, या बाहर बाहर, ओए बाहर बाहर, चल बाहर चल, चल। हाँ बाहर जाओ, बाहर है तो भी जानो। Hi, I hope I'm audible. Am I audible? No. Okay. Uh, Now, am I audible now? Yes. Okay. Thanks for the confirmation. Just let me just start sharing my screen. Mm, yeah. Just give me a second. Yeah. Yeah. I hope the screen is visible. And yeah, let's just start without further delay. So yeah, welcome back for another session. So if you have any questions or clarifications, please type in the chat box so that we can discuss them, or you can unmute yourself and ask also. So let's just go over previous week's assignment answers, question and answers. Sorry, yeah. So since that previous week was about biodiversity, so let's just have a look at them. So soil formation is an example of what type of services is a soil formation? Is it a provisioning service or a regulating one, supporting service, or a cultural service? So it's a supporting service because it kinds of supports other stuff. So the acronym HAPPO does not include habitat enhancement. And this is a case study. The elephant has a home range of several square kilometers, and it regulates the ecosystem by its habit of destructive feeding, and people can relate to this animal, which is important for conservation. Given this background, elephant can be called as so. So it regulates ecosystem, and then it has a huge home range. So it can be referred to as umbrella species, keystone species, or flagship species also. So all of them. So depending on the scenario, each of those terms apply. So here in this case, it can be considered all umbrella species, a keystone species, and even a flagship species. And religious benefits are an example of. So when you talk about uh, ecosystems providing or here in that case religious benefits, so they are more of a cultural service, the benefits provided by ecosystems mostly. So which of these is a deterministic factor? Environmental variation, forest fire, death rate and diseases. So it's death rate. So biological control of pest population is an example of provisioning service, regulating service, supporting service, and cultural service. So here, since the pest populations are getting regulated by other species, so it is considered as a regulating service. According to Leopold, which of these is not a tool of habitat management? Fire, gun, cattle, sickle. So it's sickle here. Uh, so fire and cattle, because they kind of modifies the habitat pretty much, and even gun in terms, you take out all most of the species from that area, so you kind of modify the habitat if you change the species. So for instance, if you take all of the elephant, if you kill all of the elephants in an area, so the way the elephants operate, the way they manage the habitat, there's nobody else doing there because there are no more elephants. So that in that way the gun is applicable here. So here's an example where people go to Sessa Orchid Sanctuary to watch orchids. Which of this context can be would be classified as? So here the orchids can be known as which type of species? Is it umbrella species, keystone species, flagship species, or extinct species? Here is flagship species because it's kind of drawing people towards that sanctuary so that they can witness them, and then that in turn provides protection to other set of species. And then because this species is the species that kind of advertises for that area, right? If, for instance, if you want to watch a tiger, where will you go? You will go to certain uh, tiger reserve or wildlife sanctuary or national park, because tiger is kind of the species that is known from that area. So those type of species are called as flagship species. Captive breeding is an example of, we know captive breeding, we take the species away from their natural habitat, so it has to be excited, and then it's in form of conservation, so it is excited conservation. The subset of physical and biotic environmental factors that permit an animal or plant to survive and reproduce is the definition of. So what do you call that? So it just happened. Habitat is nothing but a set of physical and biotic factors that is ideal for a species to survive and reproduce or do what it does naturally. So that is habitat. Yeah. So that's all for the previous week assignment questions. So yeah, we'll just go ahead. If you have any, I'll just wait a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes if you have any questions or clarifications regarding this. If not, we'll move ahead and discuss some of the concept you guys asked. The first one being IUCN, how what are the categories and how do we categorize species. And then following which we'll briefly touch our population growth models, not only for humans but in general for wildlife populations. And then we'll slowly try to look more, try to go and try to learn more about sustainable developmental goals. So yeah, if you guys don't have anything, I'll move ahead. So yeah, IUCN. So if you don't know the full form, it's fine. It's called International Union for Conservation of Nature. If I'm not wrong, yeah, that's it. That should be that. So this is nothing but a bunch of people trying to put up name tags to species along with help of a lot of other people in the field, so that you can prioritize species for conservation where needed, right? So they categorize species based on a lot of other categories, they do this assessment, especially the experts in the field. So if there's a person who works predominantly on tigers, so they know what all the challenges or what all the threats or what all plus points that are happening because of the conservation efforts that are being done. So they are majorly involved in these assessments. And once these assessments are done, based on the score and based on the criteria they have, they categorize those species, every species, into set of categories. And so, and then one of the major categories that requires proper conservation attention are called threatened categories. So we'll just go in the order of higher threatened to lower threatened categories. Extinct is, there is nothing left of those species. And there is another category, extinct in the wild. So there are a lot of species that have gone extinct in the wild, and there are very few populations or very few individuals that are excite to conservation measure, like zoos, or they are in captive breeding programs, hopefully, so that they can they can be colonized later. Regionally extinct, there are a lot of species that have gone regionally extinct. For instance, the Asiatic cheetah in India, that has gone regionally extinct during around the time that we received India received independence, right? But we have still have very tiny population of Asiatic cheetah in somewhere in Iran. So you call that species that have gone extinct from some part of its range called as regionally extinct. So, and then following that, there is critically endangered. And then, if you don't further act, they are going to go extinct. So that's the final category. So you have to act upon now, so that you can prevent the species from getting extinct. For instance, I think GAB, Great Indian Bustard, uh, is a critically endangered species. And there it is being, there are government undertaken programs, like for instance in there is this conservation breeding program for Great Indian Bustard in Thar desert, and then followed by endangered, vulnerable. So these three categories together, put together, they are threatened categories. So if any species is in these categories, so it has to be prioritized for conservation. And then do we have near threatened? So not you know if you don't do anything, it will end up in threatened category. But as of now, it doesn't need much attention as that much, but you should keep a look on those species also. Least concern, the population is doing well or the species is doing well, no need to worry about it. And then there are categories where the lot of species we don't have enough data for this. So this is the major thing for a lot of insects, a lot of marine organisms, where there are very few people that actually study those species. And then even so, we don't have sufficient data on how the species are doing or what are the threats to the species together. Or there can be species that have been recently discovered, and then we don't know what the true population, or there are case of cryptic species. So most of those species tend to go be classified as data deficient, and then not applicable or not evaluated. So there are some set of species that have not been evaluated because of multiple reasons, either because of the lack of experts or some any other things, right? So yeah, this, so main five categories are these ones. So most of the species that you see uh, tend to be in these five categories, and the major category is data deficient. And not average. A lot of the species are not evaluated or they are in data deficient. Whoever evaluated, they are in this category. So let's just have a look at the number of species. We'll just come back to the slide here again. So of all the species that have been assessed, so it's not like all of the species have been assessed. Very few species have been assessed according in the IUCN framework, and 28% of the species are already threatened with extinction. So they are in the top three categories, the red and orange categories. So near threatened, not in the near threatened, sorry, vulnerable, threatened, those categories. And most of these species are amphibians, because because of climate change, because of diseases. So there have been a lot of species have been wiped out and the populations have gone down. Similarly, there are set of plants that are extremely vulnerable for uh, because of this climate change, and then they are highly threatened. Even corals, birds, sharks, all of these things. So let's just go over how scientists actually go and try to assess. So the experts in the field actually go and assess these uh, categories, which category does this species fall into. So there are a lot of criteria. So this thing I picked up from the web page. If you are interested, you can just go to this link and check it out. So the first thing is to identify threats to a species, because that's what determines uh, how the species is present wherever it is. So the is just not the ongoing threats. You have to record the past threats also, what the species has faced in the past, and then what could be the potential future threats. For instance, if you talk about whales, so these days there might not be much threats for them, but in the past they have been they have been killed for because of this whaling industry. They have been The populations have crashed because people were hunting the whales. So those have to be considered. And currently there are other threats, like because of the shipping industry, busy shipping industry, and or because of climate change, the lack of food resources, proper food resources, and future threats also, they need to be assessed. And then you have to understand the stresses. So how each of these thread that you have recorded for the species impacts the taxa. So yeah, how severe each threat can be. So some threats can be very extremely severe, like whaling. If you are killing them, so that's the one of the severe threats. uh, some threats might not be that severe, but they have their own impact. So you have to understand them also. And then the habitats. So what sort of habitats the species occur in, and then you have to understand how that habitat is also threatened, so that you kind of classify them. And then to understand the movement patterns. So if it's a migratory species, so that if it migrates from one region to another, then it faces far more threats. Because if you want to conserve them, maybe you can try to conserve them in their breeding grounds, but you don't have, because it's in a different region, entire different country. So you don't have much leverage on trying to able to conserve them, right? Because that's not your legislatory zone. So you need to understand the movement patterns or congregatory behavior. Sometimes species tend to congregate in certain regions. For instance, if you have remember the case study of Amur falcon. So it's a species that breeds in the Amur region, which is far eastern region of Europe, Russia, and Siberia, those regions. And then it migrates to Africa, and then it passes through India, right? It's a raptor. Raptor are basically predatory birds, arboreal. So what happened was, this species used to stop over, congregate in huge numbers in the India, in the northeast states, right? So when it passes through those regions, actually they were being hunted for food in those regions. But subsequent awareness programs and conservation efforts have resulted in much more positive effort, reduce much of them. But if a country wanted to protect Amur falcons, let's say they said, we will try to preserve them in the protect them in their breeding grounds, that will work. But during the passage or during in the wintering grounds, they don't have any right. They can't do much, right? So you need to identify those also. Similarly, what all conservation actions are in place to protect that species at the present time? Like for instance, if you take a tiger, it's there are a lot of conservation actions. You don't have any excited breeding programs as such for now, but you have you have protected areas, you have programs, awareness programs. You have a lot of other things that actually watches for the conservation actions. So if they some species don't necessarily have any conservation actions, so you score them depending on that. And what all conservation actions actually are needed. So do we need to have awareness programs? Do we need to have inbreeding programs? Or you need to have some sort of other programs? And then what sort of research is needed on a taxon? So sometimes you need to understand the demographic, or population distribution, or just to understand how the species is doing what all. So you need to identify those also. And then sometimes how the species is utilized, and what sort of, if it's utilized in trade, what level of trade actually occurs. So is it heavily traded or versus less traded species? For instance, if you take a pangolin, it is heavily traded species, right? So what else? It is generally used in traditional medicine of multiple countries, and then and it's heavily traded. So it, that gives it higher priority for conservation should be. If it's not much into trade or anything, then the threat levels actually goes down. And how it impacts human livelihoods. There are some species that are really important for human consumption or human well-being. So you need to document them also. And then there are plant and fungal growth forms. uh, so if with this is with respect to plants. So these all things are considered. So there are subcategories for each of them, and then based on that you rank them, and then you finally try to put them into one of those categories, which is apt for that species. So for instance, there is a high threat, there are high habitat stresses, and there are it moves across wider geography, and there is no conservation action in place. There is a lot of research, and then it's heavily traded. Then it can be put up into one of those higher categories, critically endangered species. So depending on where each species stands in these all these categories, it can be put up into any one of them, right? Yeah. So that's how it goes on. So the roughly the IUCN. So this is what I could understand from how it works. So yeah, cool. So if you are more interested, you can just go around to this website iucnredlist.org, and they have a lot more stats. If you are person who are interested in numbers, watching numbers, how different things are in numbers, if it has a nice interactive web page where you can explore a lot of these things like different species, like this page that I showed you, like how many species are threatened with extinction, and different species. So there are detailed descriptions also for each species. You can just go and check it out if you are interested. Yeah. So let's just move ahead. Yeah. So we are talking about population growths, right? Let's just not talk about human population, but let's talk about populations in general. So for instance, if you take a bacteria, so it just multiplies into two, right? Sorry. So it divides into two. So and then let's say it takes a day for it to divide or to reproduce. So on day two, we'll have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. It just goes on rapidly, right? It just goes on exponentially increasing, right? Uh, so, so when you look at the growth, this is how it looks like 2, 4, 6. So, with generations or with time, it just goes on increasing, and then it's an exponential growth. So after a while, it just goes on like that. But that's not how it happens in nature, right? Because there is always there is no species, not every species can grow exponentially, because there are a lot of things that actually limit the growth of a species, be it the presence of predators, be it the lack of resources, so on. So for instance, if you keep this bacterium, let's say, this is the petri plate you are growing the bacteria in, right? So after day 6, or let's say even after day 7, even if it continues to grow, there is no more space for for the bacterium to develop, to grow further. So right, so that's there it kind of stagnates, because it can't grow exponentially as long as it can, because there are a lot of other factors that actually limit it. So what we see in a lot of the species is a logistic growth. So where species kind to tend to stop growing after a certain limit, and then the taper off there, right? So that is the number of individuals it stops is what we call as carrying capacity, or the number of species is a region can sustain in that. Uh, so here also there are multiple phases. You have an exponential phase, but it kinds of tapers up because there are either resources limiting. So it can be food, it can be space, it can be mate, or it can be any other sort of resource is limiting, or there are other factors that also kick in, like density dependent mortality. So if you have higher density, you don't have much food to get, so your mortality also increases, and so on. So this is what we see logistic growth that we see in nature, not the exponential form of growth. Even if you see exponential form of growth in a lot of species, but they tend to stop. It's not a realistic growth that you get to see in a lot of cases. So, so there are mathematical equations to it. So I'm not going to go over with that. But the main thing that you should remember is that, you know, the carrying capacity is something that determines is nothing but the number of individuals that system can support. So the species might not actually hit that carrying capacity. It will just keep on fluctuating. Sometimes it can increase, it can bounce around that region. So if the carrying capacity is 500 individuals, you will not just when you go and count that so you will not actually encounter 500 individuals as such. You might encounter 490 or 510 or somewhere around that 500 mark. So the number is arbitrary, but because the populations are actually fluctuating, nothing stays constant in that aspect. And yeah, so what do you think humans population growth goes in? So which sort of growth? Is it logistic growth or exponential growth? What do you think human population growth represented by? Logistic growth. Anybody any more guesses? Uh, what do you guys think that what sort of growth does human populations actually represent? Anybody any more guesses? Okay, so somebody said logistic growth is no. Yeah, so generally, ideally, because most of the species tend to show logistic growth, considering the constraints put on most of the species populations, one would expect humans to follow logistic growth. But humans, we are good at modifying stuff, you know uh, so we no longer are restricted by logistic growth. So the way population is increasing, it kind of shows an exponential trend roughly, but not closely exponential trend, not exact replica, but it's not logistic growth at all. So it's close to exponential, because the populations are growing very fast. Because what used to be the limiting factors, so as we were discussing right earlier, uh, resources, right? Food, if you think of food as a limiting factor, we are cutting down forests, expanding agriculture so that we can feed ourselves, or we can feed the growing populations. So food has been no longer can no longer be uh, a factor of limiting limiting factor. If you talk about space, we are also similarly cutting down forests or invading other land use would be making big buildings so that we can stay there. So no longer space. Disease, our medicine field is the way it's increasing for the past century, you know it's just there. So a lot of vaccines, a lot of medicinal procedures, they're just pushing the carrying capacity far beyond, so pushing the populations beyond the carrying capacity. So whatever used to be limiting the human populations in the olden times are no longer any acting as a limiting factor now. So the way the populations are currently growing can be considered are close to an exponential growth. So during this process, as I was saying, most of the resources, one of the major things that we are doing is modification of land. So if you look at this area, this map, so it is called LULC, land use land cover map. So much of the India, apart from the Western Ghats, Himalayas, it's not the darker green, which is form of forest, right? You see a lot of them. You see a lot of regions you see with reddish, which is uh, built up. The major cities is like Delhi, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, right? So all these built up areas actually are visible in the way when you capture satellite imagery. And similarly, there are few deciduous forest patches also that are there. So these are all protected areas that are surviving. And then outside these protected areas, the land is heavily modified. So some sort of crop, either it's kharif or rabi crop. Uh, yes. And then, yeah. So most of these lands in the Himalayas are not heavily modified, but some regions are heavily modified as such. So humans are pushing those boundaries like anything. And for us to sustain our populations in the long run, or to live a healthy life the way we are doing, it's no longer uh, a solution. So we had to work on trying to prevent, or trying to allow our next generations to enjoy the benefits that we are also enjoying. So that's where the concept of sustainable development comes in. So what is sustainable development? So development that meets the needs of present without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. So you should be able to meet your needs now. It's not like you save everything for the future. That's not also, that doesn't feel right as a person, because you want to also travel, you are also want to enjoy some stuff. But it should be in a way that you're not compromising the ability of future generations. Like you want to use all the fossil fuels today. That's not how sustainable development works. You should leave something for future generations also. So it has two key concepts. First part is the needs. In particular, it's just not the needs of everyone. It's the needs of the world's poor, because they are not well represented in that. So there should be priority for providing to the world's poor. And then the idea of limitation here, imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. And then you should be able to limit yourself so that you're not compromised, so that that whatever resource that you're using doesn't affect the people in the future to use that same resource. So these two things are really important for sustainable development to happen. So United Nations came together and and proposed these sustainable developmental goals. So we'll just go over and look how it is, what all those goals are in a while. So That's very sustainable. So you work in harmony with the society. You should be able to have economic development, and then you should have work with the environmental development also. So everything should be, all of them should be together. So that's where the sustainability is. So it's a principle that governments governs human developmental goals while simultaneously enabling natural systems to provide necessary natural resources and ecosystem services. So you're not disrupting the natural systems and their ability to provide what they are or what they are supposed to do. So you're not affecting any of those things. So that type sort of developmental goals are called as sustainable developmental goals. And then there are some capacities that are necessary for sustainable development. uh, Capacity to promote equity, so everyone should be able to do, adapt, transform. You should be able to govern, you should be able to link knowledge to action, and then you should be able to measure progress, so how much progress have gone. So these are all important. So there are 17 sustainable developmental goals that have been proposed by UN. First one is the eradication of poverty. So the main thing that we just looked at is like meet the needs of poor. So you meet the needs of poor, and then there's hardly nothing to worry about much. So that when you have no more poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. So, a lot of these things, if you remember, uh, the societal, economic, and environmental goals. So, some of them are societal goals, like the eradication of poverty or zero hunger, affordable and clean energy. These are societal. While economic, you need economic growth, you need industry and infrastructure, sustainable cities and communities, all these things. And then ecosystem level, life below. So you need to conserve life on water and land, and then you should be preparing for yourself for climate change. Just look at the ones that are related to biodiversity. So life on land. So there are a lot of things that are happening. So the forest losses, because you are cutting a lot of these forests for land conversion, and there is land degradation that is happening, and there is species extinction that is happening. So then these are increasing on day-to-day basis. So these pose severe threat to people and the planet together. So that's why you need to keep in mind when you are putting the developmental goals, so that you're not doing any of these things much. And then, so these are societal goals that we're looking at. So that works in terms of societal benefits. These are economical, like growth, responsible consumption and production, while these are biosphere related goals. And then these should all be put together. So that's why where the partnership for the goals comes in. So there should be interconnected between all of these things, and then everything should be done in concordance with other sort of goals. So that's why this is also important. Yeah, this is another form of looking at that thing. So biosphere, society, and economic together, you need partnership to be able to work on all of these things. And then it just doesn't end there, because you said let's just do development sustainably, but there should be way to measure our progress also, right? How far we have set, if you set a goal, how far we have gone in terms of achieving that goal. So that's where these developmental indicators comes in. So SDAs, or sustainable development indicators, are statistical values that collectively measure the capacity to meet present and future needs. So how well can we meet the needs of the present and the future generations. SDI will provide information crucial to decisions of national policy and general public. So it kind of informs how things have been going on. So this SDG report came in last year, 2023, and then there are 17 goals if you remember, right? Uh, so each goal has another sub goals or targets. Uh, Based on those targets, so they have been uh, color shaded on, if it's completely green, that means all of the targets are on track, or the targets have been met that have been set up initially. And yellow means fair progress, so they are doing okay, but they need to work on that. Red, there's nothing working on, so stagnation or regression. So nothing much is going on with those targets anytime soon. And then there is insufficient data. So if you look at these graphs, very few of them are actually on track of meeting those targets, and most of them are either there is very few progress or there is no progress at all, and then we don't have data on a lot of them also. So the most trend is, moderately or severely off track, because a lot of them are not on track, and over 30% have either seen no movement or regress below the 2015 baseline. So when these sustainable developmental goals were proposed during those 2015 time, that was considered as the baseline, and some of those targets have actually worsened, and then they actually gone down than what it was during 2015. So instead of progressing forward, you are actually going backwards. So that's a much more serious issue to be concerned about. So let's just look at uh, yeah, each of them individually. So overall, no poverty, so there is a lot more positive, and there is on track achieving that sustainable developmental goal. No hunger, it's kind of stagnating. But if you look at environmental level, climate action, it's kind of stagnating, and we are not doing much about it. Life below water, we are kind of improving but not that much. While life on land, the developmental goal number 15, we are doing pretty bad, we are decreasing than what used to be earlier. So yeah, and then there are major challenges considering these two are in red. So there are a lot of major challenges that needs to be addressed before we can achieve the goals in terms of biosphere related sustainable developmental goals. So we are nowhere near to achieving them at all. So what is happening? uh, the forest area, so if you remember this uh, three targets that we had in life on land. So reduce forest losses, reduce land degradation, reduction in species extinction. So what is happening to all of them? So forest area as a proportion of total land area, it has been deteriorating like anything in most of those countries, and slight or no improvement in some of those northern countries. Sorry. And it has shown improvement in few countries including India, which is a little suspicious, because the definition of forest, what used to be a forest has changed. That's why you might be seeing an increase in number of forest cover, even in the forest survey of India report that has been published for the past couple of years. That the numbers have been there in the past couple of years. So if you want to really understand that what is a forest has changed, the definition of forest, even the plantations were considered in the recent assessment, if I'm not wrong, to be forest, which is not actually a forest. That's why we saw an increase in forest area, which is not because we are, the permits for clearing forests or establishing of mines have been given out like crazy these days. Even if you remember the recent outcry against cutting up of large chunk of tropical forest that we have in India, in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, uh, doesn't actually, convey the same message as what these data points actually do, which is very far from away from the reality, right? So we are actually going below what used to be the number of the forest area. Similarly, the proportion of degraded land, uh, has it increased or decreased compared to 2015, the baseline? So uh, most of these areas have actually increased in the proportion of degraded land. So degraded land here generally could mean the land, that is not suitable for most of the purposes because they have been degraded due to various factors, either overuse for agriculture or mining or any other stuff. So a lot of these regions have actually seen an increase in degradation of land. So they don't actually provide the services that they are supposed to provide. So those lands can be considered as degraded lands. And then the red list index. This roughly talks about the amount of species decline in terms of extinctions. So yeah, they are just decreasing. So the red list index is actually decreasing, suggesting that a lot of species are actually getting threatened with extinction. So yeah, this is a map of species red list index. So it just shows a trend in overall extinction risk. So if a species are generally highly threatened, so if it's an index between 0 and 1, a value of 1 indicates there is no current extinction risk. But if the value is closer to 0, a lot of species are threatened with extinction in those regions. So if you look at India, much of the equatorial countries or the countries that are uh, they are a lot of species are kind of highly threatened with extinction, right? Because they are, if you remember the IUCN categories, so this kind of draws from those IUCN categories to put up this index, so that you can see if there are a lot of species that are in the higher red listed categories, so you'll get much values that are closer to 0. So these are estimated for mammals, birds, amphibians, corals, and then cycads. So which is a concern. So we are not anywhere near meeting any of those sustainable goals, developmental goals, in terms of the goal number 15, life on land. So yeah, so it's pretty not good, but the way people are increasingly getting aware of how we should work on them is actually pushing us forward to achieve these goals much you know with much uh, effort. Yeah, so it is really necessary to look at species from this perspective also, because you can't really tease apart human development and species conservation, because a lot of things are highly interlinked. That's why you need to think in terms of all of them. Like for instance, there is an important view like this. Uh, if you happen to go to any national park, they are considered such pristine areas where there is not a single human activity, because there humans have been who have been living for past centuries have been moved out from those areas, either voluntarily or being forcefully, because the idea what those people think it as they should not have. So that's a debatable thing whether humans should be present in a protected area versus not. But it does point to the fact that the way people live lives and the way we see nature are highly interlinked, and then it's not easy to view them individually. So that's when you think of in terms of development, you need to think in terms of, with respect to the perspective of uh, of people living in that area, and similarly other things also. So there are a lot of dilemmas that you end up in when you think in terms of border regions, where there are a lot of proposals for roads or developmental projects, and then where you you need to strengthen your border regions, but it also comes with a cost that the wildlife in that regions actually gets affected, or the people that used to enjoy the benefits of being in those regions with their lands that are associated ancestral values or religious values, they may not be able to use them as such, or the way they have been using for past few years. So there are a lot of challenges that actually come up with a lot of these goals itself. So it's not easy to achieve any of these goals, but we have a lot of countries are actually working towards meeting most of these goals. So yeah, if you are interested, please feel free to go and check out this report in detail. I just discussed one about the species on land, but if you want to understand the social or economic aspects of the sustainable developmental goals, you can look at those goals also in detail. So here we have 13, 14, 15, right? 13 is climate action, 14 is life below water, 15 is life on land. So climate action, most of it we are doing fair progress. Some, or at least 40% we are not doing anything, or we have actually deteriorated. While life on water, we have a lot more progress, but lot more regression. So we have deteriorated a lot. While life on land is the same scenario, and we don't have data for for a lot of some of those targets also. So at least for biosphere related ones, we need a lot of work for us to achieve those goals. And then in the previous, I think previous month we were discussing uh, climate change, different scenarios, right? And there we thought uh, there was a graph which I showed where we know if you want to achieve the sustainable developmental goals, we might stop at this scenario where the temperatures might not go beyond 1.5 to or 2 degrees Celsius. So if you meet the sustainable developmental goals, we can also meet our climate action climate change goals, because essentially they are interlinked, and some of those goals are shared across them. So yeah, that's all I have for today. If you guys have anything, I'll be happy to take that. But if you're interested, I would suggest you guys to go ahead and check out this report. It's a nice, interesting. So the public document is a nice, interesting document to read, because it just summarizes a lot of those things without you to be able to you know worry about the nuances of how each thing works. But if you're interested, I think there is a detailed document on how each thing is going on also. Yeah, so that's all I have. Okay, so yeah, anybody else, if you have anything, just let me know, or else. Yeah. Okay, then if you don't have any questions or any doubts, that should be the end of the session. But if you have any questions or doubts, do I will wait here for a couple of minutes. Do unmute yourself and you can ask, or you can type in the chat box. Up to you. If you don't have anything, we will call it a day. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. If you don't have any questions, you can leave. I'll just wait here if anybody has anything to ask. Then yeah, we'll stop here. Nobody has anything. Thank you for joining for today's session. See you in next week.